In this comparative study, I'll analyze the films The Handmaiden and Chungking Express through a post-colonial lens, looking at the similarities and differences in how each film attempts to break through and portray colonialist ideals within two different cultures. Throughout history, many different cultures around the world have suffered immensely from colonialism, or the practice of domination which involves subjugation of one people to another, getting their cultural identity stripped away from them, forcing them into oppression. However, as these colonized nations began to gain autonomy, a new wave of post-colonial interpretation of history rose within various forms of art, which critiqued the view of the world through the colonizer's perspective and shined light at the perspective of the colonized individuals. In post-colonial theory and film, author Posnesi states that the post-colonial cinema aims to challenge and denaturalize the colonial episteme and focus on the unframing of occluded histories. As there is no set founder of post-colonial film theory, it can be holistically defined as the movement and analysis of films through the lens of the oppressed, viewing their struggles and attempts at liberation on screen. The discussion of the films The Handmaiden and Chungking Express through the lens of post-colonialism is highly relevant due to each nation's unique cultural context. Even after its liberation from Japan in 1945, modern-day South Korea still lives between the post-Japanese annexation era. From issues like the Korean comfort woman to the split-up nation, the remnants of Japanese colonialism still has a large influence within Korea, and decolonization efforts in trying to eradicate such Japanese legacies remain high. Comparatively, an ambivalent response to colonization was reflected within Hong Kong in the 1990s. Hong Kong was about to exit colonial rule under Britain in 1997 through the handover to China. Thus, the people of Hong Kong faced recolonization, even when they have already established a unique cultural identity, mixing the West and the East together. This created an era mixed with fear and hope of the future, with some fearing the loss of Hong Kong's globalized identity created by British rule, and some hopeful of the economic development the handover can bring. Due to the fact that both films are made in different cultural contexts, as well as a difference in the way each culture experienced and responded to colonization, the films differ in its representation of its colonized past. In this comparative study, I'll be discussing how Park Chan-wook and Wong Kar-wai attempts to construct similar yet different pathways for these two cultures to respond to their colonial past and post-colonial future in regards to the usage of cinematography, mise-en-scène, and screenwriting. In both The Handmaiden and Chungking Express, Wong and Park utilizes cinematography as a way of illustrating the isolation and oppression that the colonized and societally weak individuals held within a colonial society through the usage of framing techniques. In The Handmaiden, Hideko and Suki, victims to the oppressive Japanese structure, are constantly shot through a frame within a frame, physically confining them into a space inside the screen they cannot escape from, creating a sense of loneliness and closure. Oftentimes this goes together with the usage of static, two-dimensional wide shots that Park utilizes, as if Hideko and Suki were captured within the backgrounds of the house, heightening the sense of immobility and confinement. For instance, in this scene, Suki is framed by a cage door that stops her from entering the library of Kozuki, where her lover Hideko is forced to read erotic literature out loud. The usage of a wide shot belittles Suki behind this cage door, creating a sense of powerlessness as she is surrounded and framed by the eerie architecture of the library. The transition into a POV shot and then a shot of Suki framed behind the cage looking at Hideko and Kozuki forces the audience and Suki to see her lover framed into the lustful room, but is physically prohibited from stopping such abuse, creating a sense of emotional discomfort as she cannot protect her lover because of her low social status as a Korean maid, while also hinting at Hideko's inescapability from the wrath of Kozuki. This ultimately illustrates how strong individual emotions like love were suppressed in the Japanese annexation era. Thus, to both Suki and Hideko, and moreover Korea, the Japanese annexation era was a period of physical and emotional suffering that they needed to escape from in order to gain back their freedom and love. Comparatively, in Chungking Express, Wong shows a rather ambivalent perspective on the British rule through the usage and absence of framing techniques. In the first story, Wong sides with Park on the idea of an escape from colonization, using framing specifically to tell the story of the woman in the blonde wig who tries to seek escape from the white drug dealer who was also her ex-lover. She is constantly framed within the tight urban space of Hong Kong, creating a sense of suffocative anxiety that surrounds both her fate and the future of Hong Kong. She seeks to escape this anxiety and fear through the murder of the white drug dealer, which is shot through a canted angle that frames the lady to a brighter opening, leaving the drug dealer and metaphorically the Western rule of the past, making this scene feel like Wong Kar-wai's stylistic way of announcing the end of the British colonization era and calls for the entrance into a brighter future. However, Wong's cinematography in Chungking Express differs from The Handmaiden in its continuous usage of handheld shots and absence of frame restrictions in the second half of the film. In the second story, Wong adds vibrance and a sense of free displacement to the characters through handheld shots that resist confinement and restrictions, especially when capturing Faye in her attempt to help Cop 663 out of his melancholy memories of his ex-girlfriend. Wong captures 663 within frames in the absence of Faye and her vibrant energy, illustrating the change that Faye's presence brings to his life as he slowly steps out of the past that has captured him in grief. The handheld cinematography that characterizes Faye alludes to the freedom and growth that Hong Kong and its individuals experience through the exposure to a multicultural environment created by British rule. This is also used in combination with the plethora of visual and musical metaphors Wong places within the films, such as the United Airline plane, a Western fast food store that Faye works in, and even the music California Dreamin' and What a Difference a Day Makes all act as metaphorical representations of the multicultural identity of Hong Kong. These metaphors create a sense of freedom and a unique aesthetic that combine Hong Kong's style with the West, allowing Wong to turn the hybridization of cultures mainly interpreted as violations and intrusions into sensational fascinations under the influence of Western colonialism, ultimately illustrating the message of the incorporation and synthesis of the negatively connoted Western influences as part of what makes Hong Kong, Hong Kong. The usage of visual metaphors directly connect with the intricate mise-en-scène both directors utilize as a crucial part of the films to suggest two different ways that each respective society should break through the colonial past, with the representation of the house in each film. In The Handmaiden, Kozuki's mansion is constructed as a cage that confines Hideko's autonomy as an individual, a metaphor for the colonialist oppression of Korea under Japanese rule, in which Korea's cultural identity was stripped away from them by Japan. The outside of the house is filled with green gardens and colorfully blossomed trees, adding elegance and beauty to the house, which helps the park illustrate the wealthy lifestyle that Japanese noblemen, like Kozuki, enjoy through the exploitation of Korea. However, the inside of the house is very different from its perceived outer layer, where Suki and Hideko are constantly oppressed by the distorted desires and masculinity of Kozuki. The house, especially in Kozuki's private library of pornography, is constructed using characteristics of both Japanese and Western architecture, with Hideko's performance stage decorated as a Japanese garden and the bookshelf of pornographic literature decorated in an antique European style. The construction of the house using the style of powerful imperialist cultures like Japan, which is ironically built on Korean territory, not only allows it to represent Kozuki's desires to become a Japanese noble, but also serves as a metaphorical representation of the ethnocide of Korean identity that the Japanese try to eliminate. This is evident through the fact that the seemingly elegant library is where Kozuki forces Hideko into becoming a pornographic actor against her will, sexually objectifying her and oppressing Hideko's autonomy. The fact that in the third chapter Hideko escapes Kozuki's wrath with Korean lover Suki over the boundaries of Kozuki's house hints at the idea of escape as a method of finding not only Hideko, but Korea's identity as it frees itself from Japanese rule. In Chungking Express, Wong also utilizes the house of the protagonist, but contrastingly not as a space to escape, but rather a space to change. Unlike Korea, where the only route of breaking through Japanese rules by escape, Hong Kong's handover from British to Chinese rule illustrated the idea of a changing nation and a changing culture. Specifically, in the second story of Chungking Express, Cop 63's house slowly undergoes transition by Faye. In the beginning of 63's story, his house is shot using a darker color palette with rather ragged household products all around it, creating a dull and lowly atmosphere. He is entrenched in the nostalgia and love of the past, metaphoric of Hong Kong's constant anxiety as it leaves the British colonized era into a new era of Chinese ruling, fearing the future and fearing change. Then, Faye slowly changes 63's house into a more vibrant environment. This change is evident with the change in the mise-en-scène of the house, as old products are replaced by new ones, and as Wong Kar-wai fills the screen up with bright screens in a rather messy but lively environment. This progressive transition of Cop 63's house that is shown within the screen illustrates the riddance of Hong Kong's past as a British colony, and the construction of a progressive, post-colonial Hong Kong that calls for the acceptance of new change into the future as the way of finding their own identity. The final similarity that exists between both works is the development of strong, autonomous female characters within a colonial society, illustrated through the concept of post-colonial feminism, a theory that challenges the westernized view of women's liberation and shines light on the oppressed women of colonized nations. Both Chungking Express and The Handmaiden embrace the idea of post-colonial feminism, illustrating women living within colonized nations that are the drivers of change within their culture. In The Handmaiden, Suki, the belittled Korean maid, is ironically the agent of change. A strong, autonomous individual not only pursues queer love over the threats of Fujiwara, but also liberates Hideko from the men that psychologically abused her. Suki breaks through the hierarchical social structure by acting as a mother figure of the Japanese noble Hideko, then becomes Hideko's lover as she slowly reaches a horizontal power relationship, illustrated by the symmetrical cinematography utilized during the sexual intercourse. The lesbian relationship led by Suki and accepted by Hideko as they escape the men rebel against Japanese customs that have sexually abused the woman within the film, illustrating female revelation from the perspective of the colonized individuals. In Chungking Express, both the woman in the blonde wig and Faye can all be described as women of independence that strive to change those around him. Like Suki, the woman in the blonde wig refuses to stay under the oppression of the white drug dealer, with her throwing the blonde wig after the murder symbolic of the rebellion of the colonized woman who refuses to be bound by Western rule. Being a character metaphoric of change instead of escape, Faye's identity as an agent of change is illustrated through her autonomous efforts in trying to help change Cop 63's house, as she takes individual initiative in helping her friend. The change of the room by Faye is metaphoric of the change of Hong Kong from the handover to China, allowing Wong to allocate power and the wave of change in the hands of a woman from Hong Kong. In conclusion, though both directors attempted to tackle the idea of a nation's quest for cultural identity and autonomy, both managed to illustrate it in completely different ways, with Park portraying a nation that has suffered from colonialism, whereas Wong illustrates a nation that has grown from it. Like Suki and Hideko's blossoming queer love, and like Cop63 and Faye's soggy paper tower ticket towards an unknown destination, each film manages to break out of the oppressive past that has constrained their individuality and gently pushes the characters within their respective worlds of film into a new post-colonial future that awaits them with hopefulness and freedom, even if the way in which this is achieved may be different.